Look, I think given time is of the essence, and we only have a limited amount of time with our guests today, and I'm sure everyone on the call also has a limited amount of time as well. My name is Michael Nelson. I'm the Senior Product Specialist for the LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance Solution. And I'd like to welcome you all today to a broad discussion about some of the issues that I'm sure we're all facing when it comes to the adoption and integration of new regulation around the topic of ESG. Today, I'm joined by Michael Rasmussen, who I'm sure most, if not all of you, are aware of his reputation, as well as my colleague at Cura, Warren Green. Ordinarily, I would say that Michael needs no introduction, but in this particular instance, I will give him the opportunity to introduce himself in the event that there are some people who aren't quite aware of Michael and his reputation.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to spending this next virtual hour with everybody. But I'm Michael Rasmussen. I've got 30 years of total experience and 23 of those as an analyst. And so I spent 7 years at Forrester Research. And I guess my claim to fame is in February 2002, I defined on a cold, snowy day in the Chicago office of Forrester. I defined a model to market and labeled it GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And so I spent 7 years at Forrester as one of their top analysts, and now 17 years independent. So I compete against Gartner and Forrester. So my job is research. I spend my days researching the challenges companies around the world face in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. So, and part of that GRC is ESG, and so how do we address all that? And we'll be getting into that.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Warren, joining us from Cura, managing uncertainty, which is always a useful thing to have. Could I ask you to just introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone on the call. So my name's Warren Green. I'm the Global Pre-Sales Executive at Cura Software. I've got 20 plus years experience in the GRC software domain, working with various GRC products. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, as is traditional with webinars around the world, there are always an agenda, a few agenda items. Thankfully, today it is mercifully brief and we can get on to the meat of today's discussion. Just in general terms, there will be Q&A at the end. So please, if you have any questions over the course of the coming hour, please feel free to log them through Teams and we'll collate those and try and get to as many of them as we can. Of course, cameras off, microphones off. If you have any questions, of course, please use the question box. And if there's anything that we don't get to, and again, as time is limited, we will endeavour to get back to you as soon as we can after the event's completed. So with that in mind, I might stop sharing my screen and start with today. So, Michael, I guess let's start in broad terms. ESG has been one of those three-letter acronyms that has been bubbling around in compliance and risk managers' minds, as well as at board level for some time now. But it's really only in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, as far as I see it, that this terminology has begun to crystallize into something meaningful for organizations. Is that how you see it? And if so, what do you think is driving that I guess formation towards a formal adoption of what these terms mean and what they mean for organizations?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot to unpack there. We've had previous iterations of ESG and what we've called CSR, corporate social responsibility. And in that, so we've had CSR, we've had sustainability, and some people still call things sustainability. We see that in the regulations, like in the EU, the term sustainability. So corporate social responsibility has been the older aspect of this, but CSR so often was passed around the organization like a hot potato. Nobody really wanted to own it. and too often landed in the lap of marketing and then became a branding exercise where somebody comes up with a brilliant idea. Let's put green in our logo. And it didn't have a lot of teeth. What we see with ESG is that there's a lot of teeth in it, a lot of impact. And it is a very, very complex issue. You can see this playing out in the United States right now, and the whole Anheuser-Busch and now Target and all the impact on their stocks and things for going in one direction on that without looking at their consumers and clients' interests. And so, and I'm not taking one side or the other on that in this. I'm just stating it's a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue because even around the world, you take aspects of the S, the social aspects, dealing with gender and sexuality, and what might be acceptable in Europe or North America has completely different paradigms in parts of Asia and Middle East and Africa, and so it's quite challenging. But excuse me, as I was saying, ESG's got a lot of teeth. Corporate investors like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they're making investment decisions in companies based on ESG practices. Board members are being voted out if they don't hit specific ESG metrics. Your customers, even your employees are making decisions on who they work for, not just on salary and benefits, but on shared values. So same with your customers, particularly the Gen Z and millennials. You got a lot of pressure from stakeholder groups, the press, but also the regulators. We see a lot of regulations around the world. And when you unpack the E, the S, and the G, there's a lot there. And the E can be quite confusing because everybody thinks it's all about climate change. And climate change is a huge, huge risk, a significant risk. But there's a lot more to the E than just climate change. And so like in the US, there's a lot of focus on like the SEC climate change rules, and everybody thinks this is some broad ESG requirements. Well, that's only tackling one aspect of the E, not even the full E. And when you compare it to regulations in the EU, like the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, or the EU now EU CSDDD, I mean, they're much, much more expansive across E, S, and G. While the SEC climate change rule is just tackling the climate change aspect of the E, but you unpack the rest of the E, and you not only do you have the climate change, but you got air, water, waste, pollution. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of interaction and challenges within organizations I've talked to around the world, particularly North America and Europe, on PFAS, forever chemicals, and so that's a huge issue in the E. You unpack the S, and you get things like modern slavery, child labor, forced labor. You get inclusivity, diversity, harassment, discrimination, working conditions, health and safety, even privacy is part of the S in ESG. You unpack the G, and you get internal controls over financial reporting, IT security, fraud, anti-bribery and corruption, tax transparency, beneficial ownership, all those aspects. I mean, when you really look at the ES and G, they're quite expansive. And the reality is a lot of organizations already have a lot of these pieces in play. Because there's a lot of regulations and things that play into ESG, like in little niche areas. You take something like bribery and corruption, anti-bribery and corruption laws, part of the G in ESG. I mean, you have U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, Australia's Bribery Act, SEP and Do in France, and many, many more. You go to the S and you look at modern slavery. You got the UK Modern Slavery Act. You have Australia's Slavery Act. You've got conflict minerals requirements in the U.S., California's Transparency and Supply Chains Act. There's a lot there. And so there's a lot of niche regulation across ES and ESG. But then you've got very broad things happening now too, and the where we're seeing the most traction there is in the EU, and we had earlier this year we had the EU CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. 50,000 firms have to respond to EU CSRD. 50,000 firms, that's a lot, and start reporting. But the EU CSRD is a reporting directive dealing with the requirements for ESG reports across the E, S, and G. And now what just passed the EU Parliament is the EU CSDDD. Now, before I even reference that, I mean, we should back up to Germany's law. Germany's got the LKSG. I won't try to even say the German word, the long one that the LKSG abbreviation is for. The Germans love very long, complex words. But in English, it's the German Corporation Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. I've talked to organizations all over the world. In fact, I was just in London a few weeks ago, and I'll be back in London the week of June 17th, or June 19th. June 19th, I'll be in London. But you know, I talked to a global pharmaceutical firm. I talked to a global hospitality firm. I've talked to a global food and beverage manufacturer. Each of them told me their number one risk right now in their procurement and supply chain is Germany's Corporation Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Each one of them. Ironically, each one of them also said their second biggest risk they're facing is PFAS, the forever chemicals in their supply chain. But you know, I talked to firms in Australia when I was there a couple months ago, and on Germany's law. And Germany's law has a global impact because you have to do ongoing, continuous due diligence around E, S, and G, not at the first layer, but all layers of your supply chain. So any firm that is that has significant operations in Germany right now, it's 3,000 more employees. January 1st of next year, it's 1,000 or more employees in Germany, have to directly respond. But anybody that's in a supply chain relationship with a German company has to respond as well. And so that's significant. But now the EU has taken the German law and modeled that for what's the EU CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which goes hand in hand with EU CSRD, because the CSRD is the reporting directive. Now the due diligence directive puts a lot of teeth, and basically it's past EU Parliament now. But now it has to go to the different member countries, but the big hurdle's passed now. I mean, the writing's on the wall. But every member country of the EU is going to have to pass similar legislation to Germany's law. And so the EU CSDDD, the Due Diligence Directive, establishes a corporate duty for businesses to identify, mitigate, and prevent negative human rights and environmental impacts in operations and supply chains. You know, this focuses on the operational aspects of ESG, where the CSRD focuses on the reporting. The two, again, go hand in hand. The EU CSDDD applies to EU organizations that have more than 500 employees and a global turnover of 150 million euros. It also applies to non-EU organizations operating in the EU market with turnover of 150 million in the EU market. It also applies to EU organizations with more than 250 employees and a global turnover of 40 million in high-risk industries as well. And particularly those high-impact sectors are, you know, manufacturing, wholesale, or textiles, leather, food and beverage, agricultural, forestry, and fisheries, extractive industries, and so forth. And you know, basically, what this I'm focusing on this one because there's a lot of interest in it because it's the latest right now, because it just passed the EU Parliament. But the Due Diligence Directive requires organizations to conduct due diligence on human rights and environmental related issues in their operations and supply chains, including the nested relationships, those deep supply chains, across the areas of and requiring integrating due diligence into policies and management systems, identifying and assessing ESG risks and impacts, conducting ESG risk management, remediating and mitigating ESG risk and impact, having a complaint and grievance system, continuous monitoring the effectiveness of due diligence, and publishing an annual report. And non-compliance results in significant financial and criminal consequences, as well as civil liabilities for damages caused by human rights or environmental issues. It's huge. So, I mean, so that there's a lot of regulations. There's some broad, what we're seeing in the EU. There's some specific. I mean, I know a lot of our audience is coming from the United Kingdom, and a lot of companies have to respond to the EU because they have EU operations there as well, even though the UK is separate now. But even within the UK, I mean, you've got UK Modern Slavery Act, the UK Bribery Act, and so much more happening that are pieces of this as well, and requirements for reporting too. And so there's a lot going on. That's basically what I'm saying. It's very complex, and organizations need to build programs that can address the range of these.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right. I think there's been a genuine groundswell towards giving organizations some clarity around what ESG will mean for them. But it looks as though we've got sort of a variety of different horses pulling at different speeds in that particular direction. Obviously, we've got the ISSB and what they're doing in terms of their two reporting standards, disclosure standards rather. Do you see that it's going to be the EU that sets the playing field for the rest of the world, or do you think there'll be elements of the EU CSRD and the CSDDD that will be adopted to a greater or lesser extent by those companies who aren't necessarily caught under that regime, but are looking to emulate aspects of it according to, I guess, local taste and flavor?
Yeah, I mean, right now, my advice and best practice is to build a program to the broadest set of requirements and things, and that's coming out of the EU right now. Because there's still a lot to unfold on this, and we haven't even talked about things like greenwashing and the civil liability out there as well, and just from the lawsuits for falsely making statements. So organizations need to address things, and personally, I feel building towards what some of the EU requirements are some of the best approaches right now because they're the most expansive. But when you start unpacking all the individual requirements out there from more narrow legislation, it all comes together as well.
Thank you. So it strikes me that there are three limbs to ESG. I mean, obviously, in and of itself, being alive to the impact that your organization is having in those three areas. Obviously, an environmental awareness, a social awareness, and good governance are three things to be actively applauded and leaned into. But there are a couple of other limbs as well. And I think the last one I want to talk to is greenwashing. But the first one is obviously where capital flows, because it strikes me that where venture cap and other available capital is looking for good investment opportunities, that one of the first things that they're now turning to is an organization's approach to ESG. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly, and I guess as a corollary of that, what organizations will need to do is be able to demonstrate that they're collecting the right data and being able to demonstrate that what they do is consistently good and with potential for improvement, of course. And then, as you said, applying for the sort of the highest benchmark, which currently is the EU. So where do you see organizations struggles when they're trying to achieve that initial step of being able to review, collate, and demonstrate that they're hitting the ESG marks?
Part of it's herding the cats. There's not one department completely responsible for ESG. Now, somebody needs to lead it, and a lot of times I see that's corporate compliance and ethics, or maybe an individual sustainability director, somebody like that. Somebody needs to lead it, but this is a cross-department effort. I mean, you have an environmental group, you have a health and safety group, you've got procurement dealing with the supply chain issues in this, and like modern slavery issues and all that, and you've got human resources, of course, deeply involved in the S, and inclusivity and diversity. You unpack the G, and you got finance and accounting and IT security. And of course, marketing has a role in this too, because it impacts brand and things. And this is a cross-department initiative. So some of the challenge I see organizations face is, how do we herd the cats? How do we get these different departments to work together cohesively on this? Who do we put in charge of it? And there's a couple things to look at when putting somebody in charge of ESG. First off, do they have good line of relationships to the board and senior executives? That's critical. But another key thing is this person somebody that can collaborate across silos, across departments? Because you might have a great person that's stellar at like legal or corporate compliance, but if they can't work across groups very well and inspire people and getting them working together from different parts of the organization, it's going to fail. You need some type of person that has the charisma and engagement to encourage collaboration to a common vision on ESG across the organization. So that's absolutely critical. Then a lot of organizations ask me where to start, and I often tell them, well, you're already doing something today, because you unpack E, S, and G, and there might be things you're missing, but there's a lot of things that somewhere in your organization, somebody's doing something about. And so I always tell people, start with your policies. What does your code of conduct say? What are your bribery and corruption policies, like gift, entertainment, hospitality, political contributions? What are your environmental policies? What are your health and safety policies? What are your modern slavery policies? What are your inclusivity and diversity policies? What are your policies related to ESG? Because policies are how ESG gets codified. And so we have our requirements from regulations, but we also have our values and ethics. All that gets codified in policies. Now, your policies today might not be the right policies. Maybe you need to revise some of them to address things that your organization values, maybe around inclusivity and diversity or things like that, because maybe the old policies aren't enough anymore. But you start with understanding, what do our policies currently say on these topics, which ones need to be revised, which new ones need to be added, because policies codify ESG in the organization. And then how do we operationalize that? And of course, there's a huge role for technology, because organizations that are going to just try to do ESG with document spreadsheets and emails and manual processes, it's what I call the inevitability of failure. It's an impossible task.
Yeah, and I think that then leads on to, in fact, there's a couple of different ways I'd like to explore this, but I guess looking at the micro first is, when you're talking to organizations about the policies they've got, that will inevitably feed into the ESG reporting that they're undertaking. But when we're looking at sort of a commonality of metric, when we look at a German company reporting on their status against maybe a company registered in, let's choose Delaware by way of example, against a company operating out of Greece or London, when you're looking at the ESG reports that they're preparing, how would you go about trying to make sure that the apples that you're looking at in Germany are the same variety of apples that you'd see in London or Athens?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking from a corporation perspective with distributed operations?
Yeah.
And that's getting that common vision on board across the organization. There's a place where you might need to recognize regional differences, because if you have significant operations in the Middle East, there's some aspects of your global ESG program that might not apply around particularly matters of the S in the Middle East, for example, or parts of Asia and Africa. I'm not just trying to narrow out the Middle East, because there are definitely nuances, and we even see this in how companies approach things, that in the media world, certain parts of movies are clipped out and things that aren't acceptable in certain parts of the world, and so as much as you can, you need to stick to your core values and what you believe, and apply that consistently across the organization. But the reality is, you also have to realize that there's some different cultural, regional nuances that might vary on some of the aspects of ESG as well. And that can hinder your program, but you also have to deal with that, because that's the reality of the world we live in right now.
Yeah, and I guess that led to the sort of the second limb of that question, was if at the micro we're looking at trying to find commonalities of metrics when we're reporting. I mean, the broader issue is one of, I guess, a philosophical approach. What is ESG trying to achieve, and can we actually get a commonality of approach when, as you say, there will be significant differences even within ESG, within an organization that might span the globe. I mean, I can think of, without even trying too hard, a huge number of organizations that will inevitably, because of the nature of the industries they engage in and the regions in which they operate, will be forced to have asterisks when they're reporting, simply because of what might be appropriate, indeed, legislated for in one jurisdiction might very well be contrary to the law in another jurisdiction.
Yeah, yep. And we see aspects of this already, because there's different cultures around the world where what we would consider bribery in Europe or North America is actually considered part of somebody's income in other parts of the world. And so there's different frameworks and values out there, and that can be quite challenging.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's worth unpacking that, because I think when people are beginning to look at the issues around ESG, I think what we'd all like is a simple, straightforward fix. You look at a piece of legislation and you scan through the Act and the supporting rules and regulations, and you go, I need to do this, 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 and this, and this, because it's here in black letter law in front of me. Here are the regs, here are the rules. It's a straightforward path to compliance. Whereas ESG, I think it needs to be highlighted, is that it's still, even though there are international codifications coming online and regional and national approaches to regulation, it's still going to be very much an area where there is some room for, as you say, nuance, some room for regional and cultural and societal recognition of difference.
And every organization has to approach ESG right now. They need to be doing something about that. But they also need to be careful that they don't get too far out in front of their own clients and things like that. And we're seeing that play out with Target, as well as Anheuser-Busch with Bud Light, and where they can have very strong policies on like things like inclusivity and diversity and hiring practices for employees and things. But if there's too much pressure to get out there from a marketing and merchandising perspective, and your customer base isn't accepting of that, that's a huge challenge. And so you need to be able to balance all these risks out there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because companies have like billions of dollars in market loss by getting too far ahead of themselves in some of this.
Well, that then leads to the next point, because I think that generally speaking, however ESG is approached by different organizations in different jurisdictions and different cultural milieu, there's clearly a need to do something. But matched with that is a need to demonstrate that you're doing something. And I guess, the examples that you're exploring about Anheuser-Busch are maybe people who are genuinely exploring beyond the capacity of their market to adapt to. But I guess the flip side of that is greenwashing. Now, I guess instances where organizations have gone down the path of, isn't it just easier to paint the car green than to fix the issues we've got in relation to the engine?
And to me, that is going to have a huge impact on organizations. We're already seeing a lot of greenwashing lawsuits move forward within the UK and EU. I mean, I'm sitting in Amsterdam today. I'm here this week talking about ESG at a conference yesterday and today. But just here in Amsterdam, the courts here in the Netherlands allowed the KLM greenwashing court case to go ahead. In the UK, in the past 24 hours, the news has us that the UK has banned Shell and Petronas for their greenwashing has banned their greenwashing ads, and so there's a lot going on there. And in the US, we don't have the broad ESG reporting requirements. Some people look to the SEC climate change rules. Well, that's just part of the E. That's not full ESG. We don't have that, but what's going to drive a lot of ESG forward in the U.S. is greenwashing lawsuits. I mean, in the U.S., it's the #1 litigious country in the world. I'm a U.S. citizen, and we love our lawsuits, and it's going to be the liability from greenwashing and things that advances a lot of ESG in the U.S., particularly right now as we have more of a stalemate in our political environment, because a lot of organizations in the United States are sitting back at the moment because they don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the Democrats or Republicans, they're working against each other, not with each other. And as long as neither side has full power and control, nothing's really advancing. And so a lot of U.S. organizations are sitting back a little bit on these things, but it's going to be the lawsuits that really hit them in the near term. And we're seeing there's significant lawsuits on PFAS and forever chemicals in the U.S. 3M's facing some significant challenges there, particularly, and others.
Yeah, and certainly in Australia, which is the sort of jurisdiction I'm more familiar with, I think 18 months ago, the corporate regulator here, ASIC, put out an information paper on what they were expecting people not to do when it came to promoting products. And now they've initiated proceedings against an insurer here for putting out what they dubbed a sustainable investment that turned out to have assets invested in mining companies and gambling companies. So apparently on the basis of that prosecution, a number of other investment opportunities quietly receded into the bushes as people reviewed the products they were offering and the actual association between what they were offering and what they were seen to be offering, which I think will hopefully result in, I guess, a more direct approach when it comes to both, I guess, what people are doing in terms of ESG, but also in terms of the way that they're presenting that to the broader market. So what next? I'm mindful we've got about half an hour left, and I know that Warren and I just want to dive deeply into how organizations can begin to map some of what Michael's suggesting they do within the environment of Cura, of course. But I mean, if you were to look 5 years hence with the EU CSDDD and the CSRD in place, America potentially formalizing at a federal level ESG laws, Asia engaging, Australia, Africa engaging as well, where do you see what's currently, I guess, beginning to take shape? What does that shape look like in 5 or 10 years' time?
We have a lot more maturity. I mean, it is a global challenge, and organizations around the world are going to have to respond to it. And even the regulations that we're seeing, like the EU regulations, the CSRD, the CSDDD, they have a global impact. And so the U.S. organizations that have significant operations in Europe and have to respond to it. And when you look at the DDD, then if you're anywhere in a supply chain, I mean, look at EU GDPR. It has a global impact. I mean, I've talked to firms all over the world that have had to respond to GDPR. And what you're seeing with the EU CSRD and CSDDD makes GDPR look simple. So there's going to be an expansive approach to addressing these requirements that's going to be more consistent around the world. And so we're going to have more maturity. Well, one of the other things that's going to happen in 5 years is more maturity in some of the measurement, because a lot of the ESG rating agencies, they're all over the place. Somebody gives somebody a high rating, the next agency gives them a moderate rating, and so there's lack of consistency. But as we get into more standards for reporting and the requirements and things, it's going to be easier to measure and consistently measure organizations in this capacity.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the consistent measuring, being able to, for both investors and venture cap to get a sense of what organizations are doing and how they're tracking, and then being able to genuinely determine which particular apple is the one that they're going to bite into, if that isn't stretching the analogy too far. Now, at this point, what I might do is stop sharing the screen and just bring Warren into the conversation. Bear with me a second while I do that. And Warren, let me just run you through where we're up to next.
Sure.
So first of all, let me say, before we dive into this, Michael, thank you so much for your time and your input today. I would invite you to stay on, because I suspect that we will have a huge number of questions that have come up as the result of the last 25 minutes of insight. But for the moment, what I might do is pass the conversation across to helping organizations get a sense of looking at some of the questions that Michael's posed in terms of how you would go about beginning to formulate a response to the ESG regulations that are clearly taking hold further and further across the globe, through the benefit of working with someone like Cura, of course, and LexisNexis. At which point I will pass you over to Warren, who can talk a little bit more about Cura.
Thank you, Michael. So just a little bit about who we are as an organization. So we were founded in 2002 in South Africa. We're really an established player in the governance, risk, and compliance space. So this is all we focus on and all we do as an organization. So we're very mature and experienced in the domain of health, governance, risk, and compliance. We obviously won multiple awards with our software. We've got in excess of 70 employees across 4 regions. And then we've done in excess of 350. These are large customer implementations where that's 5,000 plus. You can move on, Michael. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So currently, like I said, we're an all-encompassing GRC product. One of the benefits is we're really, really flexible and configurable in our approach. We do have a number of products, templatized products, obviously from being in the space for so long. This is just an example of some of the products that we do offer. But like I said, it's also highly configurable. So if you do have your own frameworks and your own specific frameworks, the tool can cater for those frameworks. The benefit is we follow your framework, so there's minimal change within the organization. And obviously, as that process matures, we can also mature with that process. So that's just a little bit about who we are. So jumping into the software, is there another slide? I don't think so, Michael.
There is. I just thought we could squeeze in something about LexisNexis.
Perfect.
No worries at all.
Need to do that before we jump in there.
No worries at all. It will put some context around what you're about to see. But I will be brief because I'm sure everyone is keen to see how this works in practice, and I'm sure everyone is also keen to hear the questions that you've raised and Michael's responses. In brief, LexisNexis has, in various guises, been around for the best part of the last 2 centuries. We have spent a considerable amount of time specializing in legal research. In Australia, about 7 years ago, we formed the view that the people who were good at providing meaningful commentary on legislation and case law would be very good at writing meaningful commentary on legislation and prudential standards and regulatory guidelines for the benefit of people who work in compliance. So what you'll see today is a sample of the kind of work that we do when it comes to providing organizations with clear, concise, readily accessible obligation registers, written in ways that don't require the benefit of legal training or compliance training, are translated into as plain English and other languages on occasion as required. And those registers are supported by an alerting solution that keeps you up to speed with regulatory change and how that regulatory change will affect the obligations that are caught in the registers. But that's enough about us. Let's see it in practice. I will pass you back to Warren.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's just turn off my camera. So, how do we corral these horses or sort of herd these cats? Obviously, thanks to LexisNexis for providing the content, but sometimes it makes it easier managing it in a tool. So what we do is we connect to the LexisNexis backend database, and then we bring that data in automatically into the tool, and it can be monitored then from Cura software. So what you're seeing here, this is a dashboard of our compliance obligations, but more importantly, I'll start focusing on our ESG specific obligations. Now, if we select that specific subject, we will see we've got a number of core obligations. We've got one sub-obligation related to our ESG. We've got 2 items that are compliant, or 2 obligations that are compliant. We're also sitting with 2 that are non-compliant. We got 1 in review progress, 2, and we've got 2 that we've then sent for review as well. We can also view the ratings in here, but this is an interactive dashboard. So if we do select any of our core obligations, they will be displayed in our list at the bottom, and then we can select what's for review, what's in progress. We can select by our highest or our lowest rating, what we're compliant to or not. And then obviously it will list our various ESG obligations. If we jump into one of these obligations, let's say incident management and supply chain management, we then have the name for that obligation, the reference number. We have a brief description of it. We can have comments and discussions on it. It will show the date that it was created, if it was modified, so if there is any legislation that has changed. Once it does pick up a change, it will notify you that there has been a change in that core obligation, and to go and just look out what that change is. LexisNexis then provide additional details on this. So I'm going to let Michael walk through the two details and the alerts, and then we come back to myself, where we then go and perform our assessment. We capture our relevant controls for those obligations, what we're doing in the organization, and then we can go on to review and monitor. So Michael, if you want to just talk around the details here.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think, and again, if you're as elderly as I am, you may not be able to see or read the words on the page, but you'll have to trust me on this. What the obligations are designed to do is, as I mentioned, give you a sense of what a particular branch of an organization, a particular job family, a particular collection of SMEs will need to know in relation to a given topic. So reversing the way that ordinarily obligation registers are created, which are by identifying a given compliance source, a given act or a given set of regulations, and then extrapolating out the different obligations that might fall from that. What we do is, with the benefit of the legal teams we have internally and externally, create obligations that look at particular topics that are relevant to the way that an organization conducts itself. So broadly, you look at areas like ESG or work health and safety. If you're in the financial services sector, there'll be obligations that will arise in relation to your activities in that space. And those are then written in such a way as to allow those SMEs to understand what they need to do. So what you'll start with is what we call practical guidance. And that practical guidance really sets out, through the interpolation of the benefit of our legal experts' experience, a translation out of parliamentary draftees into something approaching English about what the obligations entails. So black letter law supported by best practice and guidance and standards. The following field then really summarizes the kind of operational controls that you need to have in place in order to mitigate the risk of breach and maintain compliance. The following field picks up the consequences. Just as everybody knows on the call, that organizations that do well when it comes to compliance tend to do well in every other aspect of their operations. In the event that there is a breach of some sort, the consequence field will set out what the maximum penalties might be when that breach occurs, or if that breach occurs rather, which can be particularly useful for organizations that take a risk-based approach to compliance, where they're trying to isolate out those areas where their board might end up in prison, or they'll end up with an enforceable undertaking or significant fines. The next couple of fields really show how we do what we do. The first one is the compliance source field. And again, I think it'll scroll up in a moment. And again, it should be noted that Cura is a very flexible system. So the sequence in which I then run through the content won't necessarily be the sequence that you'll see it on their particular version. But the compliance source field will isolate the particular acts, the particular regulations, the particular standards, and within that, the particular sections or the particular regulations that are directly on point to that particular topic. So you can see what you have is clear guidance in relation to compliance, clear guidance in relation to controls, clear guidance in relation to risk, and clear insight into where all of that material's been drawn from. Now that's caught in the registers. The way that the alerts talk to the registers is that inevitably, when regulatory change occurs, there will be some shift in your obligations. In Australia, on average, every year, there's something in the order of 5 and a bit thousand individual regulatory and legislative change pieces. So staying on top of that can be an unpleasant task, I think, is probably the kindest way to put it. So what we do is, whenever bills are brought to Parliament or regulators are calling for submissions in relation to particular content, what we'll do is review that, identify which particular modules, which particular obligations within those modules. And when I say module, I mean broad topic like tax or work health and safety or banking, and then give you a summary of what the changes will be, and then a call to action that lets you know what you now need to do in order to respond to that, as well as some other material as well, jurisdictions and so on. So while the registers show you what the law is today, the alerts keep you up to speed on what the law will look like tomorrow. Then, of course, when the law takes effect, we rewrite the obligations in the registers and flag that with an alert to you. So it's a way of constantly staying up to date with the obligations that are directly pertinent to you without you necessarily having to review the constant flow of reg change that's coming out of the nation's parliaments or the nation's regulators. Once all of that's bedded in, that's where Cura shines. And I will pass you back to Warren now.
Thank you, Michael. So once we've obviously viewed the details on that particular obligation, we viewed any alerts that may have come in, it's now time for us as an organization to go and perform our assessment. So here we will then have who is responsible in the organization for this particular obligation. We will notify the person that there is an obligation that they are responsible for. And likewise, if there are any changes in this particular obligation, it will look at who is responsible. It will then notify that user and they can then go and action accordingly. There will also be obviously suggested consequences for non-compliance to that obligation. And then we'll have potential remedial actions for that obligation. We'll also provide the source, so you can click on that source and that'll give you a source link as well. What we can go and do as an organization, we can then go and capture our relevant controls that we have in the organization to address that particular obligation. And whether those are policies, as Michael mentioned earlier, whether those are specific ways that we need to report, these are then controls that we can capture against our particular obligation to reduce, obviously, the risk rating. We would then typically use the organizational's risk rating framework, if you have one, where you can go and assess your likelihood, the impact that would have on your organization. That would calculate out your risk rating. You can upload any evidence or documents that you need, and then you can provide additional comments. So that's on our assessment type. Now, once we've assessed our obligation, we obviously need to move into a continuous review and monitor of that obligation. There's no point in just saying, yes, we're compliant to this obligation, and then we park it off and leave it. So we have our review options. So whether this is sent for review, the last review date that this obligation was reviewed, and the next date that we're going to be reviewing it. We can also then have comments from our reviewer that he would capture, and here we can then capture our overall compliance status for this particular obligation. We can also, at a later stage, we can start bringing in any breaches that were identified for this obligation across the organization. So this would be coming from your incident module. So any incidents that are logged in the organization, even though they're happening outside of your silo, can then be linked up to your specific obligation. So it starts bringing us to breaking down these silos and sort of corralling these horses and herding these cats, where we start getting additional information from the rest of the organization. We can also have audit, go and audit these specific obligations and audit our controls. So if there were any particular findings against that obligation, we would then be able to capture findings against it. The users can also go and create actions or tasks for that specific obligation. So if we are required to create things like a specific ESG incident report, we can send that to somebody else in the organization, and then we can track those action plans based on their various statuses. And that at a high level is how we can then monitor our obligations from a systematic point of view. And if I go back to the dashboard, we then can go and view our information and determine our overall level of compliance. So it's just an additional tool to help us corral the horses and herd the cats and get an overall view in our organization. And that really at a high level is an overview of how we would manage the ESG compliance with the Lexis content in a systematic type approach. Over to you, Michael.
Brilliant. But thank you very, very much, Warren. I think that was clear and concise and easy to follow, much like ESG generally. Well, it will be soon. Look, in terms of questions from the floor, we have a relatively shy audience with us today. But one of the questions that I think's come up would be, and here's a question now. ESG regulatory compliance solutions, about what countries are covered by the tool that Warren just displayed.
So do you want to answer that, Michael? So we are using the LexisNexis content. So they do provide content for the various regions. Do you want to dive deeper into that, Michael?
Yeah, look, that's a good point. And I think that there are two elements to the answer. The first goes to Michael's point that ESG isn't able to be caught in a single bucket. I think there are elements of what people are currently doing that will fall into the kind of the broader pool, if you like. So modern slavery, obviously, privacy and data protection. There'll be elements of environmental law that you'll need to do, all of which we will cover. And so at the ESG module that we saw before, what that looks at is broad brush, excuse me, what the international standards are when it comes to adopting ESG reporting within your particular jurisdiction and looking at the different methodologies that are available, TCFD, for example, being one of them. And that can then be supplemented by the other modules that we offer, where ESG forms part of that broader obligation set caught within those discrete topic areas. Now, I believe we have a second question. This is from Daniel, and thank you, Anna, for that question before. And this is a really interesting philosophical question. So is ESG rather, reg and compliance mostly driven by developed countries or developing countries? And is this likely to change? And there's a supplementary question is there likelihood of pushback in relation to ESG?
Say that once more.
So first, I guess there's a couple of questions. First is ESG regulation and compliance mostly driven by developing or developed nations? And do you see that shifting any point soon?
Well, I mean, a lot of ESG is definitely being driven by more developed first world nations. I think that's pretty straightforward there. But the downward impacts nations around the world. I mean, third world and everything else. I mean, because it impacts a lot of behavior and things that we see in deep supply chains and operations in a lot of countries that aren't first world.
And do you see that shifting over the course of time?
I mean, there's a downstream impact, but it's definitely being led by the more developed nations.
Yeah. So the consequential question from that was, do you see any sign of people pushing back against these ESG requirements that do seem to be coming from the developed nations?
To a degree, yes, but unfortunately, it's a cost of doing business now too, and so a lot of those developing nations have to respond to this, and it can be a little bit more of a tax on them, but this is the nature of the world we're in right now, and so there's definitely a cascading impact on those countries, and there's a cost to them in that aspect, but and there's also, in some respects, a change in values and perspectives on that to be more in line with developed nations as well, and so there's a lot of considerations, as I guess what I'm saying. It's a very complex issue.
Yeah, and I suspect there'll be geopolitical aspects and some colonial legacy aspects to consider as well.
Yep.
There's another question from Jitesh. I assumed that when he said MDGs, he meant Millennium Development Goals, and he has just clarified that. So Jitesh, thank you very much. So the question is, what's the link to ESG and the UN's Millennium Development Goals? especially in relation to government?
I'm not specific. I don't have specific insights in that.
Okay. All right, Jitesh, feel free to expand on that question if you're still with us, because I think it's certainly something that warrants further consideration. Because obviously, what we have is a variety of aspirational goals that organisations and countries around the world are looking for, primarily to get a better insight into what companies are doing that pulls us slightly less close to from the precipice, which we seem to be getting closer and closer to every day. But I guess from my perspective, and going back to that second question about the pushback to ESG, and I think with reference to a point that you made before about, in particular, the States, where we're looking at a genuine disconnect between the nominal left and the right in America. Do you see ESG becoming a potential political issue in the same way that climate change in isolation seems to have become a political issue over the course of the past 30 years?
It most definitely is already in the U.S. And you see a lot of pushback on from the Republican side, and I hate to say that because I mean I tend to be more conservative too, but and so I hate to categorize a whole political party because there's spectrums, there's a lot of pushback from what would be considered the far right on ESG and out there, and even in the political campaigns, there's a lot for like the next presidency. We're seeing a lot of that messaging come forth.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's become sort of a hobby horse that people can, well, hoping presumably to ride all the way to the White House.
Yep.
We have another question again from Anna, and thank you. In your experience, Michael, where does ESG sit in an organization? Does it form part of the compliance team, help human resources, work health and safety, or is it a new cross-functional division that sits adjacent or above?
Well, it is a multi-department initiative. And so there's not one department for ESG. There's multiple departments need to work together. Somebody needs to lead it. The one I interact with the most is corporate compliance and ethics leading ESG. Sometimes people create a whole new group to help lead it. In small to mid-sized firms, sometimes you even see audit leading it and others, but that becomes a conflict of interest because audit shouldn't be providing assurance on things that it's actually managing and monitoring from that perspective. But and so there's a variety of roles that lead it, but again, the most common one I come across is corporate compliance and ethics. But then after that, it's some new function that is a sustainability ESG lead separate from that. But no matter what, it requires cross-department collaboration, cross-organization collaboration. But to really do it effectively requires that whoever is leading it in the organization can cooperate across silos and build bridges and get people across these departments to work together.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense putting it in the compliance space because compliance managers already have that requirement as part of their basic skill set to get everybody else in the organization to understand the importance of compliance and risk. So if they can do that, then presumably it's just a natural corollary. Now, Jitesh has come back, and again, thank you, Jitesh, for clarifying this. He notes that there are 8 Millennium Development Goals, combating poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, environmental degradation, and discrimination against women. So clearly, with the addition of sort of environmental degradation, that would form part of the ESG framework. But it strikes me that all of that seems to fit neatly with all of E and S and potentially G as well. Would you agree?
Yeah. It's a very complex intersection of many themes. And the physicist Friedrich Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they're interconnected and interdependent. And ESG is a complexity of interconnections. And some concluding thoughts. You know, the reality is we're headed to one of two futures. I wrote a blog on this called "A Tale of Two Futures." We're headed towards the future of Star Trek, which is a green and environmentally and socially friendly future. Obviously, they're movies, so there's conflicts. Or we're headed towards that future of Blade Runner, you know, where it's that environmental and social dystopia and disaster, or somewhere in between. But the decisions in the past, not only that governments set, but that corporations sets us on the path to one of those two futures right now.
Thank you. And on that, let's take the positive out of that and aim for a Star Trek future rather than stepping into a live action rendition of Blade Runner. I'd like to thank Michael again for your time and your insights and sharing the benefit of your experience with us today. It's, as always, a huge pleasure to hear you talk. So thank you very much for your time. And I hope the weather in Amsterdam continues to be lovely. Warren, also, thank you for the clear and concise demonstration of what is, as I know, a very complex and diverse tool. So thank you for doing that in what I think is record time. And thank you to all of our participants today. It's been a pleasure to be your host, and I look forward to having further conversations with you in the future. But in the meantime, wherever you happen to be around the world, all the very best for your morning, afternoon, evening, or night. And look forward to doing this all again with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.